This is the second video of RS-503 research methods. We're in the process of going through one of our primary textbooks, Turabian, the 8th edition. The last video we covered the first two chapters. This one we will cover chapters 3 and 4. The first two chapters laid the kind of a general philosophical foundation for doing research, and now we're going to get into more nuts and bolts. One of the main areas of research is finding useful sources. So after you've decided on a topic, ask a question, come up with a working hypothesis, come up with a working answer, you need to go about finding evidence, finding data. And so that's in the sources. So we're going to try to give you some guidelines for finding sources here in Chapter 3. So we're going to begin with 3.1.1, consult primary sources for evidence. So what is a primary source? Well, if you consider, say, American history, and you're looking at maybe a battle in American history, or say in World War II or something like that. Primary sources for that would be first-hand accounts of journalists covering the battle. Perhaps you could find journals or diaries written by soldiers involved in the battle. Military records would be primary sources, that kind of thing. Newspaper accounts, first-hand newspaper accounts of the battle, things like that. So those would be examples of primary sources for something like that. In biblical and theological studies, obviously the primary source is the Bible. And if you go even further than that, it would be the Bible written in the original languages. So the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament, the Greek New Testament would be kind of the bottom line primary source. And then in a way, an English translation or the translation into your language would be considered in a way a secondary source. So you always want to consider primary sources when you're doing your work. And so for us here in our field of biblical and theological studies, the Bible is the primary source. Secondary sources you learn from other researchers. So secondary sources, like in the area of biblical studies, would be commentaries on biblical books, things like that. Bible encyclopedias, Bible dictionaries that have articles about the Bible, but they are not the Bible. So in that sense, they are secondary. Now, in theological studies, if you are, say, interacting with a certain theologian, his book that you're interacting with will be one of the primary sources. But then other theological works that contribute then would be secondary sources. Why do you want to look at secondary sources? Well, you want to keep up with current research. So it's very important, I think, in doing research is to find recent sources. Now, in our field, starting in the 1800s and going till today, there is a lot of fruitful, good work out there. So in our field, I do not hesitate to go back to old sources. Now, other fields that would probably not work. In science, science changes so rapidly, and so something written in the 1800s might not be so relevant. But in our field, older sources are still very relevant. But at the same time, you need to keep up with current thinking. And So secondary sources are real good to keep up with current research, to find other points of view. Thinking on subjects is evolving all the time. Thinking changes over the generations, and so you need to know what is the current thinking on this subject that I'm researching. The secondary sources will help you find models for your own research and analysis. So if you find a recent journal article addressing your issue, that may prompt your thinking, how did this particular author approach this? And you might decide that's a good way. I like his approach. Or you may think, you know what, I didn't really care much for that. I'm going to go another way. So that's a good reason to look at secondary sources. Tertiary sources are described here as introductory overviews. Tertiary sources are useful, but really much less useful than secondary sources. So in the area of biblical studies, a tertiary source might be say you were writing on a book of the Old Testament, say Amos. A tertiary source might be an introduction in a study Bible to the book of Amos. That would be that would give you an overview, not super in depth, but it would get you started maybe. Then you could go to the secondary sources, the commentaries on Amos, and then of course the primary source would be the text of Amos itself. Now 3.2 is important. Record your sources fully, accurately, and appropriately. And the first step you want to take is determine your citation style. And the citation style that we use in our school is the notes bibliography style. In many commentaries, you'll see the other one, the author date style, but we don't use that here. We use the notes bibliography style. So that's what we'll be teaching you from Turabian. Okay, we want to skip now to 3.4.2. Some guidelines on evaluating the reliability of print sources. It's very important when you're doing research, to try to evaluate the quality of the source that you are considering. So the first question to ask, is the author a reputable scholar? So as you kind of move through seminary, you're going to get a feel for, in Old Testament, in New Testament, in theology, who the reputable scholars are. Names will surface, and you'll get used to different names. It's very important to have a reputable scholar. Books will cite the scholar's academic credentials, and even if it doesn't, you could Google that person and find his academic credentials. You don't want, to use sources written by someone nobody's ever heard of, that sort of thing. So a reputable scholar. And I'm going to give you some information. In fact, one of your required textbooks will help you in this search for a reputable scholar, and we will go over that in class. Secondly, is the source current? So we've kind of talked about that already, but for sure you want to be as current as possible in your research. Is the source published by a reputable press? This is another important thing, and this is another thing that you'll kind of get used to. you'll hear the same publishing houses over and over in your study here. You know, there'll be William B. Erdman's, and there'll be Baker and Zondervan and Hendrickson, and there's others. But you know, Broadman and Holman, I could probably think of more. But you will find out who are the reputable publishing houses, and you certainly want to go with them. Now, many of you will purchase Bible study software like Logos or something like that, and Logos will have lots and lots of sources. But just because it's in Logos does not mean it's reputable. And so I've run across some sources in Logos where the author was not reputable, his publishing house I'd never heard of, but students were using it because they found it in Logos. Well, that's so don't just think that because it's in your software package that it's going to meet you know, a good, reputable test. In the case of journal articles, is it peer-reviewed? So you will, again, as you go through seminary, you'll find out in Old Testament studies, New Testament, the theological area, what are the reputable journals and which ones are peer-reviewed. So you will probably not use things like, you know, Time magazine or something like that in your work. Those articles are not peer-reviewed, articles like that. Has the source received good reviews? So reputable journals review commentaries, they review other periodical articles, and so look for reviews there. Has the source been frequently cited by others? So again, as you look at commentaries, you can see who a particular commentary has cited. And then if you look at another commentary, there may be some of the same ones. So if a person is cited over and over by different commentaries, then you can be pretty assured that that's going to be a reputable one. 3.4.3, evaluate the reliability of online sources. Now, I realize that for many of you, your only research option is online, depending on where you live, that kind of thing. You may not have access to a good theological library. So 100% of your research will be online. So the question is online reliable? Well, it can be. So here's some guidelines. Number one, the site is sponsored by a reputable organization. Some sites supported by individuals are reliable, most are not. So, for example, a reputable organization would be the Evangelical Theological Society. They have a website, and they have a journal, the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, that comes out in hard copy print, but they also post it on their website. That would be a reputable place to go. And also, we're going to show you how to do research through our library here, online research through our library, and there will be reputable journals available through that as well. Number two is related to a reliable professional journal. I just gave you a example of that. It supplements reliable print sources. So, like I said, the Evangelical Theological Society, ETS, puts out a print copy, a print journal. But they back it up by putting that journal online. So that is a good, reputable source there. Number four, does the website avoid heated advocacy for or against a contested social issue? You want your website to be, if it is reputable, it is very even-handedly presenting information. It's not, it doesn't have an axe to grind again on some issue. And that's kind of like number 5 here. It does not make wild claims, attack other researchers, use abusive language, or make errors of spelling, punctuation, and grammar. You can tell very quickly when a website is a professional or not. And then it's really helpful if you can tell when the website was last updated. If you can't find a date anywhere, Turabian says, be cautious. The bottom line, trust a site only if scholarly readers would trust those who maintain it. If you don't know who maintains it, be skeptical. So, like I said, I feel like that for most of you, online is your way to do research. So don't be guilty of this. You Google the subject of your research paper, and all this stuff comes up, and you just start using it. Well, you don't want to just use it indiscriminately, because I've had papers with sources that I just had to put a question mark, like, where did you get this? This is clearly not a reputable source. So you have to be just really careful when using online sources. Let's skip now to chapter 4 of Turabian, engaging sources. And we're going to start with 4.2.1. How to take notes. Like the other steps in the research project, note-taking goes better with a plan. So you're thinking here, how boring can this be? How to take notes. I know how to take notes, but there are good ways to take notes and ways that are not so good. And so Turabian says you need to set up a system. And one tried and true system is to take notes on 3x5 index cards and write them out long-handed. Now, some of you are thinking, you got to be kidding. I'm not going to do that. Well, that's fine, as long as you have a system that is reliable and you can keep track of everything. But this old-fashioned system is terribly efficient, however. And so if you are doing research, you got a set of cards there, you write everything down, and it's a good way to keep things organized. You can put a title at the top of the card to kind of keep track of things. Now here's, we're going to go, in our next textbook, we're going to go over note-taking a little bit more. Here's some guidelines on when you are taking notes about when to summarize, when to paraphrase, or when to quote. So you come across some information that you think is really going to be useful for your paper. So what do you do? Do you quote the author directly? Do you paraphrase him? Do you summarize him? And so here's some guidelines. So let's just read this together. Summarize when you need only the general point of a passage, section, or even the whole article or book. So if you only need the broad point, you can summarize. Summary is useful for general context or related but not specifically relevant data or views. A summary of a source never serves as good evidence. So summarizing is okay in a kind of a broad general sense, but it's not the best way to go. Secondly, paraphrase is better. Paraphrase when you can represent what a source says more clearly or pointedly than it does. Paraphrase doesn't mean just changing a word or two. You must use your own words and your own phrasing to replace most of the words and phrasing of the passage. A direct quotation always serves as better evidence than a paraphrase does. So paraphrasing is good if you come across evidence and the author has given good evidence, but he hasn't really stated it as well as he could, and you think you can state it better. You know, get the point across, but state it better. Putting it in your own words is the better way to go at that point. But did you notice what they said here? Paraphrasing is not just changing a word or two here or there. Okay, you really need to put it in your own words. If you just change a word or two here or there, and then really don't give credit, then you are committing plagiarism. Now the third thing is exact quotations, and that's really often the best way to go. So here's some guidelines for exact quotations. The quoted words constitute evidence that backs up your reasons. If, for example, you wanted to claim that people in different regions responded to the Battle of the Alamo here in Texas differently, you would quote exact words from different newspapers. So you want to quote when the words are from an authority who backs up your view. You want to quote when the words are strikingly original. You want to quote when the words express your ideas so compellingly that the quotation can frame the rest of your discussion. And finally, you want to quote when you state a view that you disagree with, and to be fair, you want to state that view exactly. So my basic guideline is I want to quote a person if they say it so well that I could not possibly improve on the way they present it. And in fact, I would make it worse, okay? So a quotation is good in that regard. Now here's this final paragraph here is important for note-taking. If you don't record important words now, you can't quote them later. So copy or photograph more passages than you think you'll need. Never abbreviate a quotation thinking you can accurately reconstruct it later. You can't. If you misquote someone, you fatally undermine your credibility. So double check your quote against the original and then check it again. You have to quote people accurately. And so when you are in the note-taking stage, you have got to, however you do it, writing it on index cards, using a copy machine, taking pictures with your phone, whatever you do, you get the whole thing, because you can't really just guess at what you might have left out. This next question, or section 4.2.3, guard against inadvertent plagiarism. Sloppy note-taking has caused grief for students and professionals alike, ranging from ridicule for trivial errors to professional exile for inadvertent plagiarism. To avoid that risk, commit to heart these two iron rules for recording information in notes. So you need to pay attention to this, okay? Always unambiguously identify words and ideas from a source so that weeks or months later, you cannot possibly mistake them for your own. As recommended above, when we're talking about taking notes, record quotations and paraphrases with quotation marks, as well as in a font that unambiguously distinguishes them from your own ideas. And never paraphrase a source so closely that a reader can match the phrasing and sense of your words with those in your source. And finally, another important point down here at the bottom. Never assume that you can use what you find online without citing its source, even if it's free and publicly available. So on online sources, you still need to cite them, and give them credit. Nothing releases you from the duty to acknowledge your use of anything you did not personally create yourself. So keep those rules in mind. More on plagiarism a little later. And finally, lastly, section 4.4, just a tip from Turabian: write as you read. Writing forces you to think, and think hard. So if you have an idea as you are reading along, doing research, go ahead and write it down right then. Because the more you write down, and the sooner you write down, the sooner you understand really where your research project is headed. And Turabian recommends that you write a fixed amount at a fixed time every day. Now, I know as a student, practically, that's probably not going to happen. But it's better to write a little bit as you go along instead of trying to cram it all in the night before. That will never work. So the exhortation here from Turabian is to write something as you go along. That will help you think through your project, and it'll help you keep on a schedule. So that is chapters 3 and 4 from Turabian, and we will look at the next chapters in the next video.